Good evening. Welcome. I'm Michelle DiMarzo, the Curator of Education and Academic Engagement at the Fairfield University Art History Museum. Thank you, Dr. Lysov, for shushing the crowd from the front. It's my pleasure to welcome you to another event that is being presented in conjunction with our ongoing exhibition down in the Bellarmine Hall Galleries. That's In Real Times, Arthur Szyk, Artist and Soldier for Human Rights. If you haven't seen it yet, it is on view through December 16th. Our traditional opening hours have been Tuesday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. Starting in November, we will be open until 8 o'clock every Thursday night. So if this is a difficult time to get into the museum in our usual opening hours, please keep an eye out for that starting in November. You can also visit our website, fairfield.edu/museum/Szyk, S-Z-Y-K, for more information. And tonight's lecture by Dr. Deborah Varat is part of the Edwin L. Wiesel Jr. Lectureships in Art History, funded by the Robert Lehman Foundation. Dr. Varat received her bachelor's in philosophy from the University of Rochester and the Master of Arts and a PhD in art history from Boston University. While in graduate school, she was a gallery lecturer at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and she is now professor of art history at Southern New Hampshire University and also director of their Public Humanities Initiative. Dr. Varat has lectured widely on a variety of topics, including art and family life in 18th century England, American interpretations of the Dreyfus Affair in 19th century France, and representations of Jewish immigrants in the popular press. More recently, she's given talks on art and Judaism, which leads her to Arthur Szyk. Her topic this evening is Szyk's cover art for Collier's magazine and how it helped Americans visualize the evils of fascism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Deborah Varat.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. I feel very lucky to be here tonight. I was interested in this artist a few years back, and I thought someday I'll look more into it. And I was doing some other research, and I stumbled across the fact that there was an exhibit going on that was currently, at the time, in New Orleans. Wasn't that where it was before here? New Orleans. And to my amazement, it was coming next to Fairfield, Connecticut. Fairfield is my hometown. And that seemed to point me towards not putting it off, but actually starting to work on it now. And I got connected up with Carrie Weber and Professor Lysov, and I managed to get myself into this series as a lecturer. So I just wanted to say that I'm very grateful that my parents are here tonight, because they still live in Fairfield. My oldest friend, who I met in first grade at Riverfield Elementary School. A colleague of mine who drove all the way down from New Hampshire to be here. And I welcome all the rest of you too, and thank you for coming. Joseph Ansel, in his excellent biography called Arthur Szyk, Artist, Jew, and Pole, laid out the following information in his introduction about Szyk's artistic production during the war years. Quote, Szyk's work appeared in such magazines as Time, Collier's, Esquire, and Coronet. Between 1941 and 43, he created at least 4 cartoons per week for the New York Post, and his work was distributed nationally by the Chicago Sun Syndicate. More than 1 million American soldiers saw his anti-fascist caricatures in exhibitions held at military training centers, and Szyk willingly complied with thousands of requests for reproductions of the most popular ones from Allied forces engaged in fighting throughout the world, end quote. In addition, exhibitions of his work were held around the country in galleries, libraries, and other public spaces. And these exhibitions were, in turn, reviewed in major newspapers, such as the New York Times, often with an example from the show. His cover art for Collier's magazine, numbering 8 in total, are some of his most developed, artistically complex works from his vast body of popular imagery and demand to be considered in depth. He had, in his words, a, quote, total war mind, and his unwavering goal was to condition Americans to the, quote, toughness, bitterness, and hatred necessary to win the war. In service of this aim, Szyk did what no other artist did or even tried to do, which was to reveal the terrifying evil of the Nazis and their accomplices in order to persuade Americans of the need for maximum effort to defeat this threat to humanity. Szyk's first Collier cover is from November 1st, 1941. I want to get a feel for what the covers were like leading up to that first cover. And so I want to start here with this one from September 27th, 1941. Before TV and the internet, magazines were a very important way that people experienced popular culture. I thought I would start by asking you, even though I can't, it's so dark in here and I have a light shining my eyes. Oh, there we go, I can see a little better. If any of you remember what magazines came into your house when you were growing up? Yep.
Life magazine.
Life magazine. I heard Saturday Evening Post.
National Geographic.
Okay, National Geographic. The New Yorker.
Playboy.
Really? Playboy? Seriously? The New Republic, I just heard.
The Nation.
Okay, The Nation. Time and Newsweek. Okay, so these kinds of magazines included all kinds of different kinds of material, and Collier's was one of those kind of general interest magazines, and it included fiction. And if you think that we have a short attention span today, let me just tell you that Collier's invented the idea of the short story, which was less than a page long. So that doesn't show a lot of confidence that people would turn the page to keep going. It had sports, news, humor, poetry, advertisements, and advice. Like the Saturday Evening Post with Norman Rockwell's famous covers, Collier's presented an upbeat and wholesome view of American culture that millions enjoyed. The darker aspects of the American experience are not referenced, and this is a great example of a charming and humorous mismatch of couples. This cover, the next week, October 11th, is a fairly upbeat view of an American pilot. We should remember that America was not in the war in October of 1941 yet, but there certainly was a lot of activity getting ready for mobilization. And it certainly looks like a thrilling and adventurous opportunity as shown in this cover here. The next week, we have this cover. And this one was done by an artist who they used fairly often named Gilbert Darling. And he signed his name Ding, D''ing. And he was one of a stable of regular artists. And so this is an amusing and sort of glamorous cover. And the amusement comes from the very glamorous woman who obviously has run out of gas and who's getting a ride from this native person on a very long-suffering donkey, while wistfully looking back over her shoulder where she seems to be leaving behind civilization. And that's where the comedy comes from. There is a caption at the bottom which does indicate something about the war, but it's very much off to the side. It's not really what's meant to first grab your attention. The next week, on October 25th, had this cover, and we have a beautiful sort of beauty queen glamour shot here of a blonde, blue-eyed American woman wearing very modern clothes. She looks a little wistful and lonely, and the reason why, if you look at her hand, is she's wearing a ring, and that ring has a military insignia on it. And so therefore, we are to deduce that her boyfriend or her husband is off serving in the military armed forces in some manner. Again, we were not yet in the war, but it's a little bit at least of a reference to things that were happening leading up to the big event in December of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The next week was Szyk's first cover. On November 1st, 1941, subscribers to the magazine and those who saw it on newsstands were met with this shocking image, completely different from the preceding covers, and also a much more serious representation of Hitler than Americans had typically seen up to this point. The context for this cover is that Hitler had invaded Russia, or Germany had invaded Russia in the summer of 1941, and therefore they were no longer allies, they were enemies. So what's shown here is a high-stakes poker game. Let me see if I can see my own notes. There we go. Okay, if you picked up this cover and looked at it agape, if it had been delivered into your mailbox, you might have found that a letter would slide out onto the floor. This was a letter written by Szyk to the magazine that was included in every copy, and everyone around the country who subscribed would have received this letter. The letter is in the exhibit downstairs. Those of you who have been down to the exhibit will see that letter in one of the cases in its very distinctive red ink. And in the letter, Szyk tries to describe what it was that he was trying to do in the image, but also express his gratitude that he, a recent immigrant from Poland, basically a recent refugee from Poland, was allowed this amazing and very important opportunity to do such prominent artwork. And he says at the bottom, it is a real privilege, and he signs his initials AS. So let's move on and take a closer look at the image. Okay, so what you see here on the left, and by the way, in many cases here I have the original artwork and then also how it appeared on the cover, and sometimes they're the same and sometimes they're a little bit different. Certainly the originals look more high definition, so that's the ones that I really want to focus on. So anyways, here you have a small table of a poker game, Hitler versus a sort of generic Russian, and they're playing poker, and Hitler has 3 jokers in his hand, right? And those jokers are, I think it's Mussolini, Pétain, and it looks like I'm not sure who the last one is, but on the other side of the table is the Russian, who has only 2 of a kind, but those 2 of a kind is the United States and Great Britain. And so the idea is that those 2 will trump the 3 of the jokers, and so the Russian will prevail. And sitting on the other side of the table is Death in the uniform of a German World War I soldier who has been highly decorated with many medals, and I'll show you that in just a second. But then on the floor is a whole bunch of kind of down-and-out allies who are nothing more than puppets. And so you see Mussolini, and you see Franco and Pétain, and a bunch of other kind of pathetic, lifeless characters who are on strings at the bottom of the page. So here I just want to show a close-up where you can see the kinds of medals that German World War II soldiers might have earned, and those are represented there by Death. So when you look close up here, who's going to win? Well, the Russian's going to win. But ultimately, Death is going to win, because there's going to be a lot of people who wind up on his team in the end. Wherever he comes from, that's where a lot of people will wind up. So whether it's Germany, whether it's the Allies, in the end, many, many people will die. I also think that when you look at this Russian, who's now our ally, he doesn't look like a very nice ally to have. He looks like a Cossack. He looks uncivilized and savage. And so there's a complicated kind of bunch of contradictions here at the center of this cartoon, and that's the kind of thing that Szyk did often. I want to compare Szyk's imagery to another image that was made at the same time by a different artist for a different kind of a purpose. So on the right is an example of the Philco Corporation. They were an electronics manufacturer, and they ran a whole series of ads for themselves, but also with sort of propaganda cartoons, obviously for the American side. And you can see that it's the same kind of scenario here, where you have a card game, and you have Hitler, and you have cards, and you have, in this case, a map and coins piled up. And I wanted to ask you here, what you think is the difference between these 2 images?
Perspective.
Okay, what do you mean by perspective?
Well, it's a first-person perspective on the right-hand side.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, this is the reader's perspective.
Okay, so on the right-hand side, it's a first-person perspective. And who is that first person? Can you tell?
An American.
Am I having, yeah, an American. So you have the star on the sleeve. So it's, as you say, it's like us. We're the Americans, so it's our perspective. That's very different. Over here, we're a little bit at a distance, and we're sort of outsiders just looking in. What else seems different? Yes?
The amount of money.
Good point.
The Russian has more, in the other instance, the Nazis, well, and his buddies have more.
Right. So the amount of money that the Nazis have is a lot more. Of course, their coins are Nazi coins, so perhaps they're not worth very much, whereas the Americans have American coins, which would naturally be worth more. Yeah.
We can't see what cards Hitler's holding in this instance.
That's right. We can't see the other side's cards. And on our side, we have some very impressive cards. We have the cards of industry: planes, tanks, guns, ships, men. How can you get better than that? That's a full house, a royal flush, whatever those terms are. I can't keep track of it. But so it looks like we definitely have, quote, the upper hand here. Okay, Hitler looks different. Yeah, so what makes him look anxious, would you say?
Facial expression,
Mm-hmm.
not, very solemn.
Okay, so maybe he looks frustrated or angry that he may lose the game. And his allies look so small. They look like they're about to drop off the face of the earth. They're so kind of comically small. Also, Hitler's on the other side, safely on the other side. We're on this side with this great big strong American hand and all of our advantages, whereas here, somehow we are on the side with Hitler. It makes it more uncomfortable for us. So because of the image on the right is part of propaganda, sort of for a corporation, it's very straightforward and it's very rah-rah American. And that's something that Szyk does not do in his work. So if you look here, I wanted to make a point that Szyk used themes that he developed over and over again. He used specific cartoons in many different kinds of publications. They were reproduced in newspapers all over the country, but he also would return to a certain theme that he had already developed. So this is a case where he used that same theme, but this one is for a steel company. And I think it's Douglas. Here we have it. Well, I'm sorry, I can't really easily read my notes in this kind of light, but it's for a steel company, steel manufacturer, and it's a card game that's also much more favorable to the American point of view. So on the other side of the table, you have Uncle Sam, and he's the tallest person there. And you have all these, you have John Bull over there on the right, and all of the, quote, bad guys are diminutive, small, and look troubled and like they're losing the game. Okay. Okay, so moving on to the next cover. This is one that was published in January of 1942, which was after Pearl Harbor, but he actually drew it before Pearl Harbor. Okay, and so what we have here is a cover that he titled Madness. And if you look at Hitler in this picture, where he's contemplating mastering the entire globe with his flunkies of Goering, the commander of the Luftwaffe over there on the left, the big corpulent, blonde-haired, clownish-looking person, and then on the right, that's Goebbels. He was the minister of propaganda, the short guy with all the flags. And then Himmler standing behind Hitler. Himmler was the head of the SS. So he was the one most associated with death in particular. And as he's contemplating that whole globe, you look at his face and he looks insane. So the beady little eyes and the strange expression on his face as he's contemplating this crazy plan or agenda of taking over the whole world. When you look at the way that Szyk represents these fascists and these thugs, he always shows them with these great big black boots on. And I can't help but think of that famous George Orwell quote where he said, "If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stomping on a human face forever." That's the kind of boots that stomp on human faces. The irony here in this image by Szyk is that he's using a kind of imagery that in the past had often been used for anti-Semitic purposes. And so there's many, many cases of anti-Semitic cartoons where Jews, in fact, are the ones who are taking over the globe. Sometimes they are spiders, sometimes they are octopuses, sometimes they are bats getting their claws into the entire globe because of the accusation that Jews had an international financial conspiracy and were threatening the world order. And so that on the right is something that Szyk would have been well aware of, and he turns it on its head to make the Nazis the one who are taking over the globe. So that was a clever sort of a move on his part. In this view, you're looking at the cover, the original artwork that the cover became, and you can see here that he's included Mussolini and Pétain, and in this view, they actually are directly underfoot, under that boot. Other important things to notice here is that there's a snake at the bottom, a rattlesnake, covered in swastikas, and while they're busy doing this thing with their evil imperialist plans or expansionist plans, this Nazi snake is sneaking away and nobody even sees it. So the idea that there could be many more dangers and we don't really know where they're coming from is the kind of thing that Szyk, I wouldn't say enjoyed, but that he tended to do, which is to not give you any really easy images, right? Because we can't see something like this and think, well, this is crazy, and therefore we don't really have to worry about it. It's crazy in a way that is terrifying, and the dangers aren't contained. If you look at the comparison between the center detail here, on the left, this is the actual cover of Collier's, and on the right is the original print. There's one fairly significant difference, which is that on the cover, the pins of the flags are literally drawing blood from the globe. And that's much more pronounced than over there on the right, especially in Europe. So you see the flags with the blood pouring down over France, even in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and further into Central Europe. And I wish I knew if there was some conversation that went on between Szyk and the editors of Collier's in order to enhance that feature, because as you can see, it's not nearly as prominent in the original. This is another case of a Szyk image that seems to relate to other kinds of motifs that artists were using at the time. This is another of the Philco Corporation advertisements with that snake, the snake with the swastikas all over it. And here we have one of the snakes is Hitler, one of them is Hirohito of Japan, and then you have poor Mussolini is only a pathetic worm. and then there's giant boot of American might who's going to crush those snakes. And if you compare what Szyk did with his snake and this one, this is a cartoon meant to make you feel very confident of American power to defeat fascism. Whereas, again, Szyk is not really giving you that kind of confidence. We have to be very much on guard. We have to do absolutely everything we can. We cannot just assume that these dangers are going to be so easily crushed underfoot. This is another case where a cover of Collier's seems to relate to other images or appear in other kinds of publications. So Look magazine was a very prominent photography magazine at the time, and they reproduced that image with the title of Hitler's Butchers. And then over here in Esquire magazine, it's not the same image, but it has a similar flavor to it with the idea of planning to take over the whole world. And you can see that there's all these figures there. It's called the Map Makers, and Goebbels is looking directly at Hirohito, I suppose, or Tojo, and saying to him, now that you've joined us, the Fuhrer will make a special map for you. And there's all these maps on the floor, and you can see here that, I think we all know that South America was not, in fact, conquered by the Nazis. Question?
Yeah. On the globe on the right,
Mm-hmm.
we saw in the previous slide also, there's one part that's in German, which says, today we own Europe, tomorrow we'll own the whole world.
Right.
It supports that. It's interesting that one part is in German, everything else is in English.
Right, right. So I'm sure you know, because you've seen the exhibit downstairs, that you're very rewarded for spending a lot of time on these images with a magnifying glass, because there's details within details within details, and there's no place not worth looking closer at in his work. And that's also, of course, very different from these kind of cartoons. A cartoon like this could probably be pulled off in an afternoon. Different level of artistic complexity and rigor. Okay, so this is a cover, the third cover, published in 1914, but still drawn in 1941, so still sort of right there at the time of Pearl Harbor, right? So probably responding to Pearl Harbor. And he's got here the basically trifecta of evil, which is Mussolini and Hitler and, Hirohito. And there's some other details that I want to draw your attention to. But first I want to back up and take a bigger look at something, which is, how did people encounter these kinds of covers, right? So Collier's subscription rate at its height was 2.5 million. 2.5 million is 2.5 million addresses that it was sent to. But we just all said that there were magazines coming into our households. So that's 2.5 million houses that received this magazine. And in a house are multiple people. And that doesn't include the newsstand sales. So newsstands used to be a major way that people encountered popular media. And I don't know if there's any newsstands left. I remember back when I first moved to Boston that there was a wonderful newsstand in Harvard Square. and it was right in the center of the square, and it had all kinds of stuff, and there was always people looking at things, flipping through things, and you could see all kinds of things that you hadn't thought of before, you hadn't encountered before. It's a little bit like the internet before the internet, where your eye just roves around and you capture something over here or an image over there. And so this is a photograph of a newsstand in the 1940s. When you look across, you can see Collier's up at the top, right? So it's a fairly large format magazine. It's not like the New Yorker or Time magazine. It's larger than that. And you can see all kinds of things. McCall's, that's a women's magazine. Look and Click, these are photography magazines, and then other kinds of popular sorts of things like westerns and detective stories. And here's another example where you have Collier's up here with the Saturday Evening Post right at the top, and all kinds of other things down below, Time magazine, and then piles and piles of other magazines. And one more here. What do you do to stand out if you are a magazine competing with all these other magazines? What kind of cover would draw people to buy a magazine? And then you have to think, well, what are you competing with? And it's hard to see in a black and white photograph, but you can see some color images that really give you a sense. You're competing with comic books with their very dramatic, dramatized theatrical covers with heroes and bad guys and people being punched out, and of course Hitler here on this first version of Captain America. You see guns and shooting and all kinds of things like that. You see things like this. You see sexy pictures. You see murderers. You see terrifying dramas taking place in front of your eyes. All of these covers are trying to lure you to buy something from the newsstand. And so when you think about Szyk, Szyk is an artist that doesn't easily fit in any category because his artistry is on such a high level. So you're inclined to think he's a fine artist, and he is a fine artist. But he was working in popular media. And so then you say, well, what were his competitors? His competitors visually were things like this. And I think he knew that. And if you think about that, when you go back and look at the Szyk covers, you realize maybe what he had in mind is to grab your eyeballs, is to pop off of that newsstand with terrifying imagery, with shocking imagery, as much as possible in the service of this political aim. So coming back around to this cover, it's a great title that he gave to it, where he's somehow rhyming Hirohito, Hitlerhito, and Benito. It's a little hard to say that. Murder Incorporated. And when you look a little bit more carefully at this image, certain things stand out. First of all, Hitler and Mussolini look very shabby. Their clothes are torn up. Their boots are coming apart. They've been at this now for a while. But Hirohito, who's just gotten in, looks spiffy and in a nice, spanking, shining new uniform. So that's terrifying enough. But when you are that shabby and that desperate and you have nothing to lose, that's another whole kind of terror that is being presented. If you look close up at the hands, you can see that their hands are dripping in blood. And in particular, Mussolini's hand has the so-called stigmata wound. And I'm going to talk more about that in just a moment, so I'll just leave that hanging. But the wound in the center of the palm is a very significant kind of wound. Then on the other side of the image, there's something that to us Szyk aficionados is funny, but actually it's a pretty dark joke, right? So he's got this little skull type of soldier figure, skeleton soldier, holding a book that says The New Order, and at the bottom it says Gestapo. But Szyk had a book called The New Order in this very distinctive yellow cover that came out just a little bit before this time. And his book is all about lampooning these very people. So he's throwing a little bone in for people who have been following his career that you might catch a hold of that. And another interesting detail here is down here. The dagger held by Hirohito, which is dripping in blood, has a tag on it with Pearl Harbor. So we know, of course, that Japan was responsible for Pearl Harbor. But the visual of the tag looks like a crime scene tag, like it's a piece of evidence that it's being presented here for us to see. Here we have another example where the cover then appears in another publication. And I don't know which newspaper this is, but it's obviously a lot greater to see it in color than in black and white. But it goes to show that you can say that Collier's had 2.5 million subscribers. You can add all the people that were in the households who saw those, all the people who bought it at the newsstands, but then also the image got reproduced in other settings. So these cartoons of his had a great big viewing audience at the time, much, much more than any fine artist of the day. I mean, you can't say that, I'm trying to think of a good example, like Thomas Hart Benton or Jackson Pollock or any of these artists who are part of the pantheon of art history had nearly the audience that you can achieve if you're working in popular media. Okay, so Bloody Hands in March 28th. So this is a cover that he drew in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. And you see here he's presenting Hitler like a medieval knight, okay, flanked by famine. It's a little hard to see these words, but famine on one side, and of course the Japanese figure on the other side. Hitler here is presented with an iconic frontality, and that iconic frontality is a pose that comes from religious art, specifically from Christian art. On the left is a mosaic from a church in Florence representing Jesus in the moment of the Last Judgment. And you can see here that Jesus has the wounds of the cross. And Hitler also has sort of like those wounds, the stigmata. So in Christian history and Christian theology, saints through the ages at times were, I guess you said, blessed with the magical appearance of these wounds on their palms to show their connection to Jesus or to God. And so to show Hitler like that was a special kind of dark irony. And so think about the different kinds of things going on here. Let's see. The Last Judgment. The Last Judgment is the end of times. The Last Judgment is the apocalypse. And to relate Hitler in this image to Jesus at the Last Judgment is a very fitting thing. The Last Judgment is when people, for once and for all, either go to heaven or hell. It's the end of the world. So that seems very fitting. The stigmata wound is transformed into victim's blood here. And the angels have been transformed into ghouls. So why would he have done this kind of imagery? What is he going for? Why the reference to the Christian icon that some people would have known? So I have two ideas about that. One is that if you think about who Americans were at this time, there were a lot of Irish Catholics in this country and a lot of Italian Catholics in this country. So Catholics know all about the stigmata. That imagery is from their religious context. But also, those two groups of people may have had some difficulty with their loyalties during the war. Italians, of course, coming from Italy, which was an ally of Hitler. And then the Irish. Why would the Irish have had some difficulties? Anyone know? Yeah, they hate the British. They'll be with anybody who's against the British. So that was very difficult, right? And so
Joseph Kennedy was anti-British.
Okay, there you have it. Joseph Kennedy was anti-British. There's one example to prove the point. And so to kind of remind those Americans, right, that this cannot be who you're siding with, because remember what matters to you, and think of how perverted this is if Hitler is standing in for Christ. So the other reason that relates is that fascism itself is a new secular religion. It's a religion around a charismatic leader, and that charismatic leader is to be worshipped kind of like a god. And so here's Hitler in that role of a god, and there's something completely grotesque about it if you bring forth that association and make people have to really confront what that means. If you look closely at the hands and you see all of that blood, you can see that the way that Szyk applied the ink made it look like blood dripping down. you don't think of him carefully painting in each drop. Think of him maybe, I mean, at least it looks like this, dropping a big blob of ink and letting it run down the page so that it emulates that sense of blood just pouring out and dripping down. Okay, so I want to move on to the two of the three last covers that Szyk did for Collier's. Both of these happened in the wake of Pearl Harbor. And Pearl Harbor, of course, got the United States engaged in the war and also turned the United States against Japan. So Japan was now a hated enemy. And I want to talk a little bit about these images for a moment. One is, if you look at the one on the left, and you see that the Japanese, the very distorted racist caricature of the Japanese man is holding Mein Kampf. Think about how absurd that is, because Mein Kampf is where Hitler expressed his racial doctrine of Aryan superiority. And how can this character be considered part of the pure blood of the Aryan people? I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous with the brown skin and the animal-like characteristics. So that's absurd on the face of it. Let's see. I think that it's a little uncomfortable. I actually heard a little bit of a gasp when I put up the slide to see things like this today. We're very sensitized today about this kind of imagery, and you can't help but see it as very racist. But I would like to say that, first of all, it's not the most racist that was done against Japanese. There was lots of racist anti-Japanese caricature in the American press at this time. And this is a whole series called Tokyo Kid. I don't know if it's intentionally misspelled or not. And I mean, these are, I mean, they're all terrible, but these are kind of grotesquely terrible, shockingly terrible. They don't look human at all anymore. And they have very dark skin, and they speak in a very silly way, and they're rooting for us to make mistakes every which way. So this is just two out of a whole set of images. Another relevant point is that, like with the earlier example, where Szyk turned the idea of grasping the whole globe from an anti-Semitic stereotype against the Germans, this too has a lineage, this idea of the bat, the human turned into a bat, who is, of course, a predator, right? A predator who kills by drinking blood. And so this is, Der Stürmer was it's an infamous anti-Semitic newspaper that came out during Nazi Germany. And this is just one cartoon that shows the Jew as the bat. So somebody like Szyk would have been familiar with this kind of imagery. He had grown up in Europe. He had spent time in Paris for years before coming to North America. And to now turn it around so that on the Nazi side you have these, blood-sucking, dangerous monsters is particularly telling. If you want to think a little bit more about why these cartoons of the Japanese are so vicious, even worse than the way he shows the Germans looking, I think that it's relevant to point out that the Japanese killed Americans. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and killed thousands of Americans. The Japanese continued to commit war crimes against Americans. So there's the Bataan Death March that happened in April 1942, and that was widely reported in the newspapers. It was in the front pages of the New York Times. So this is obviously a little glimpse of the newspaper within a propaganda poster talking about torture and other kinds of horrible things that happen in the Philippines perpetrated by Japanese against American soldiers. So Americans were very horrified specifically by the Japanese, right? Another point is you have to wonder, when did Americans first start learning about the Holocaust, right? So we can say that Hitler was trying to take over the world. We can say that Hitler invaded many countries and he, destroyed Poland and all kinds of other horrible things that he did. But the real horrific war crimes were not necessarily reported so clearly. In fact, the New York Times suppressed the news. There's a fascinating book called Buried by the Times, all about how the Times, which was owned by a Jewish family, the Salzburgers, bent over backwards not to seem too sensitive to the Jewish issue, to the point where the news was barely reported and was in the back pages of the newspaper. So it was the Japanese who were perpetrating war crimes against Americans. And whatever else was going on in Europe, things like the Holocaust by bullets, that was not in the news. Okay, moving on to the second to last cartoon here, a cover of Collier's. This is the only somewhat upbeat cover of the 8 that he did. It's called America, Democracy at Work. And before I go further into the meaning of the image, I'd like to point to the absolute incredible beauty of the image, the incredible and gorgeous miniaturist detail all around the frame, and the flags embedded, and the beautiful palette of the red, white, and blue coming through. That's beautiful and very striking. There was a lot of propaganda in the United States that were touting American power and our industrial might, and reassuring Americans that we had everything it took to win the war. And I'd like to show you a couple of those images. So, for example, here's just a collage of some samples. On the upper left, that's actually an advertisement for cigarettes, but you can see that it shows an American pilot looking very happy and very excited and heroic and young and optimistic, right? There's nothing terrible to see here. And then you look at all these other propaganda images, and they also show things like, planes being produced and that very strong American arm coming through, so that we don't have any doubt of the power of our industrial might. The Navy, so you have sailors who are screwing on bolts. And down here, this beautiful image in the bottom center of the building of ships. It's very close up. It's a little bit more artistic, perhaps, than some of the other ones. And then on the right, defense in the air begins on the ground. And you see the planes in the sky, and you see the industry in the background, and the airport down below, and then this towering figure holding an American flag. So if we think about these in contrast to each other, and we look at Szyk's image, which shows all of these very strong industrial workers who are holding guns and building tanks. You can see tanks right here. And let's throw in the Statue of Liberty to remind us what it's all about. And you have planes up in the air and all this industrial production going on at full tilt, and all of this throughout the image. It has sort of the same kind of message, or does it? So I'd like to ask you again if you feel like there's something different going on between Szyk's interpretation or his presentation of American might during wartime as compared with just a straightforward piece of propaganda that you see over there on the right.
The snake.
Okay, so you notice the snake, so why do you think that's significant?
The danger is still lurking.
Mm-hmm. The danger is still lurking, and do they see it? No. So that snake that crawled out of the other image is now somehow on our shores, and it's tangling itself around one of the pillars of democracy. So there's a lot of danger here. We are not in the clear at all. Anything else? Yeah. Oh. They look suspicious. Okay, yeah, it's a little hard to read their expressions. Like, what are they thinking right now? So they're sort of frowning, and they're certainly not smiling, and I don't know, they have a different demeanor. So.
Well, one thing that's missing on the image on the left are women. And women were a big part of the industrial
Mm-hmm.
industrial scene, as the men were on it.
You're right.
And the men were on the front. So,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm thinking that there's a bias there that strength would be better conveyed in using male figures than women figures.
That's very interesting. So in case you can't hear, or if you're on the live stream and need that repeated, there's no women in the Szyk image, and women played a very important role in wartime production. Did they play a role outside, or were they in factories? So that's one question I have. Of course, that doesn't show women either, but also there were propaganda posters that did feature women, but just not this particular one. Yes?
Well, it looked like they were octuplets up here. I'm looking at the men's faces, and they're the three on the right going up, they're really very nice. But I think the three on the left, I think only the guy in the middle with the blue hat looks slightly different because he has a 5 o'clock shadow. But they all look like the same person or family.
I know. They don't look very differentiated.
It's a serious, determined look of these men that are all relating themselves in this industry to win the war.
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite
It's a
catch.
serious, determined look on all the men's faces.
Serious and determined.
In a congealed way together.
Right, so they're working as a team, they're very serious, and maybe they are important as members of that team, not really as individuals at this moment. Any other thoughts?
One thing can't see here, that Deborah, on the sword is the word democracy. And another name for this piece was the arsenal of democracy. And so they're wielding the sword of democracy in their fight. You can't just make it out. It's hard to see on the sword.
Right, right. Good point. So it was pointed out by our distinguished guest, Irvin Unger, that the sword has the word democracy on it. And so they're fighting for democracy. But then again, the pillar of democracy is being compromised by that snake. So I had a little thought about the uniformity of the faces, which is from Tolstoy, which is all good faces are alike, but each evil face is evil in its own way. There's something more satisfying about caricaturing evil, but good is less interesting. So they're just generic Americans at work. Yes, Harry?
With the Szyk imagery, it seems the intention is for it to be read like a script.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and there's like an intentional inclusion of as much material to support the story as possible. And the use of juxtaposed color as opposed to intermingled color on the right,
Mm-hmm.
to like bring in the art shop into the conversation is both have a very different kind of feeling. One, the Szyk is very specific, while the imagery on the right is more general.
Good point. So the Szyk is a lot more specific. As you say, he has so many details. He's telling a story. It takes more time. And it's not a poster that you're supposed to walk past and catch at a glance. The one on the right is a poster. So propaganda posters we're working on a different premise, which is that they're hanging outside and people walk quickly by. You need to be able to understand it all at once. But you can't do that with Szyk. It's way too detailed. So that's maybe also a difference that he took advantage of. The magazine sits in your house. You can spend a lot of time looking at it. Do you think there's anything to explain why he would be so much more sort of, what was the word you used for the expression? Suspicious or dark, or not really having that same kind of proud American feeling on the right? Why would it be that his are different in that way?
I think they look determined
Mm-hmm.
and angry. I don't think they look suspicious.
Okay, determined and angry, but not like these. Not like these people. Different than these people.
Because it's not glamorous to go to war.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it's not glamorous, and his work is not directly propaganda, as we've been saying. Yeah, tired, okay. So we also have to think about who Szyk was, right? Szyk was a new American. His family was in Poland. His mother would be killed in, was it the Warsaw Ghetto? So his mother was a victim of the Holocaust during this time. And so he had skin in the game. He had people in Europe. He was Jewish, and his people were, he just had come from Europe. So it's easy enough, perhaps, if you're, a natural-born American with whatever background you come from, to feel very proud and rah-rah patriotic. But for Szyk, who did have a tremendous amount of idealism about the United States, he doesn't find any of this something to celebrate. He's more tainted by the tragedy already at this time. And that brings us to the last of the 8 covers, which is arguably the most terrifying of all, the cover where he equates Hitler directly with the devil. And one second. If you look at this over here, and let me just get a close-up here so you can really see, what he's doing here is he's trying to equate Hitler with the devil in certain very specific visual similarities. So you have the same cleft chin, the same beady eyes, the same position of the arms, with the devil right behind him. The devil is his muse, so to speak. And that's a very terrifying claim to make. I've been thinking about this image since Tuesday night. I don't know if any of you here, or I know some of you did, but saw Art Spiegelman speak. Because he made an interesting point about Szyk that I have been thinking about, which is that Szyk almost gave Hitler too much credit by making him look so terrifying. And other cartoonists didn't really do that. They tended to go in a different direction, which was to lampoon, make him more like a clown, to ridicule, and by ridiculing, taking power away. And that certainly is one effective way of political sort of warfare through art, is to do that. So here's a great example on the right. You know, that's not terrifying at all. He looks ridiculous. He looks like a soccer ball that you would just kick across a field. And you're meant to laugh, and he's totally absurd. And if you look through how other cartoonists of the time represented Hitler, it often has that tone to it. So on the left is Lawson Wood. He's a well-known cartoonist also who did these kinds of images for Collier's and other places, and to show a Japanese monkey leading a rickshaw, is that what it's called, with a monkey version of Hitler on the back, and they just look comical and absurd. And on the right, more monkeys. And in this one, Hitler himself looks like he has no idea what's going on, and Mussolini's about to have his tush, shaved or whatever. That would be a good outcome by this spinning sword. You can also look to Dr. Seuss. Many of you may not know, I'm particularly thinking of the students in the room, you probably did not know that when Dr. Seuss was not doing Cat in the Hat or Horton Hears a Who, he was busy doing anti-fascist cartoons during the war years, and there's certainly an amazing body of work. There's a couple of books on it. There's one that's called Dr. Seuss Goes to War that highlight this work that he did. And you can see he has that same approach, which is Hitler's a fool, Hitler's a clown. And so specifically in this center one, which is, I think, really early, it may even been before the war, he's showing Lindbergh, who of course was an apologist for the Nazis, patting, again, here we have the snake again with the swastikas, but then Hitler's face, he just looks so cute and like a charming, tame pet, right? So that's one approach. And Szyk took the other approach. So here we have Dr. Seuss on the left, and Hitler here looks like a Most Wanted poster, right? It looks like a cartoon Most Wanted poster that could be from a Sunday morning cartoon or Saturday morning cartoon. So he does look like a bad guy, but he doesn't look like a terrifying bad guy. Nothing like this.
I think that ties in with the image you showed us a little while ago of the workers.
Mm-hmm.
The workers toward the bottom especially, somebody said they look suspicious.
Mm-hmm.
To me, they look fearful. The ones on the bottom are more fearful than the ones on the top.
Mm-hmm.
And that ties in with making Hitler look powerful.
Yeah, so I honestly, I can't decide. I think that both are very powerful. I mean, I know that Donald Trump has been caricatured in different ways. There's the balloon, the Trump balloon. If you know about that, that's the clown side. And then there's much more other kinds of imagery which would present him as a much more dangerous figure. There's just different ways of addressing this through art. And I don't know if this is better. I mean, Spiegelman seemed to prefer this method, but you can't deny the power of what Szyk was putting forth there. And he never gave up. He kept doing more and more of these gut-wrenching, devastating images. So here's a couple of cartoons that on the left is from 1943, which is after when all these covers were made. And the caption says, "Who told you I am not victorious anymore?" And there's a pile of dead Jews there, and the word ghetto. So he's strutting and flexing as though this is a big accomplishment when those are powerless, unarmed, desperate civilians. And then on the right, again, a row of skeletons and a skeleton underfoot, and he looks absolutely insane and terrifying. So I'd like to end with 2 more slides. Sorry? Yeah, so this is Szyk, a self-portrait, and he says he's at the end of his rope now, and this is December 1943. So that's not the end of the war. The war goes on for another 1.5 years, right? So this is not quite the end of his rope. But there's something so wonderful when Szyk puts himself into the images. If you do, or if you have, or if you're going to go again to the exhibit, there's several prints where he's tucked himself in a certain spot as a witness and as an observer, but also sort of as a participant. And here he's outmatching Hitler, this giant, again, evil figure, by putting the noose around his neck and by sitting in front. There's another great cartoon where Szyk shows himself at his writing desk, at his art desk, and he's drawing Hitler, and this little figure of Hitler is like desperately trying to jump off of the page as Szyk is drawing him. But Szyk has the pen, and the pen is mightier than the sword. So I'd like to end with this wonderful photograph portrait of Arthur Szyk, and to quote a letter that he wrote to William Chenery, who was the editor of Collier's when he was working for Collier's. The letter was written in October 20th of 1943. This is a letter that I found in the New York Public Library archives. And he wanted to express his gratitude for the opportunity given to him to get his work out there. Quote, "I had the pleasure of serving Collier's, a magazine which will always have great significance for me. It was in Collier's that I started my career in this country." And that concludes my presentation.